So my name is Shwetak Patel. This is Tom Conti. We are here to talk a little bit about networking, building your research village. So what we wanted to do was spend a little bit of time giving you our thoughts about networking, why it's important, and just tips and some strategies that we've employed in our careers, which it may not be the best way of doing things, but it's just reflecting on kind of how we've thought about how we have looked at expanding, your research network. So we'll have a few remarks about kind of our thoughts in the space, but I really want to spend most of the time actually having a conversation around it. So we have an hour for this session, and we'll spend most of the time actually fielding questions and really hearing from you in terms of what's top of mind for you as you embark on your careers, and some of the things that even you've done that has actually shown promise, or tips or things that you can actually share with others. So we want to make that conversational. But before we do that, I just wanted to share a few thoughts in the space. So I'll go ahead and start, and then we'll have Tom come up and talk about this a little bit more. So why is networking important? I mean, it's fairly obvious. I mean, a lot of grad students often get this same talk. It's like, the first year graduate students that often ask me about a conference is, what should I go do? What you should do is actually, interact with your colleagues and your cohort that you started with, the more senior people in the community, the researchers that are doing work that you're, that you would potentially want to collaborate with. So that story doesn't change. What changes a little bit is the scale at which you have to start to think about doing this now. Good research is not just about doing good work. I mean, good work is important, but if nobody knows about it, then you can't really showcase that work. So one of the critical components of networking is the fact that the networking is what enables you to actually showcase your work in a way that people know that it's good work, or they can build off of it and you can get good feedback from it. And often for citing your work and looking at opportunities, if you think about funding opportunities, where you want to go on to that next sabbatical, or even finding a great sabbatical, people kind of have to know who you are. They have to kind of know who your students are, your lab. And also what makes it a little bit more complicated is that you're not just networking for yourself, you're actually networking for your students and your students' students. And so you have a little bit more there where you're actually helping and enabling your students' careers as well. And people often talk about, we often talk about people getting to know you is, most of the battle in terms of getting your research out there. And it's a stressful thing. It's also something that a lot of us that are introverts have a hard time doing that. And so I'll share with you some of the things that I've done and some of the things that I think would help in terms of trying to figure out how you get into some of these networks that slowly these opportunities can evolve. But really at the end of the day, it's really networking is basically half the battle in terms of showcasing your research, right? So that's why it's really important. So there's when I was thinking about how to actually structure this, I could actually talk for an hour about like different things that I've done or didn't do or should have done. But the three things that actually stood out for me when I have been reflecting on my career is that one of the first things to think about that I never operationalized, but in the end I realized that this is something that kind of helped me out a little bit, was thinking about your research network map. So what I mean by this is like, who are the network of people that you would go to for various things in your career? And you often think about, maybe it's just that research collaborator or the people that do research in your area. If you're a networking researcher or an HCI researcher, that's your research network. In fact, it's actually broader than that. And you have to think about it in other ways as well instead of just topical areas. And I'll talk about in a second like how to actually think about this. But think about who your research network is, because the network can be an easy place for you to reach out, folks to reach out to for getting advice in different areas. The other thing is that a lot of times we pattern match with other colleagues or people that we look up to or other folks that are doing really well. But your research village actually looks different depending on the type of work you do. So it's good to pattern match, but you also should realize that you can have a different strategy, and your research network map could actually look a little different than others. And so we'll talk about how those could be different and things to think about to put in your research village. And the other thing is that showcasing your work has changed a lot. Like if you think about 15 years ago, the way you showcased your work is you make sure you go to a conference, right? You make sure you have a presentation there. You do posters. Now things have changed dramatically, both in terms of the way you can scale, the way you disseminate your work, but also how it's disseminated with social media and blogs. And so I'll talk a little bit about the scale and broader ways to think about that. So this is something I borrowed from the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. And so this is something that when I was reflecting on and I saw this, I said, wait a minute, I kind of did this, but I didn't have all the pieces there. So this is one way to kind of think about your mentoring map. You know, you have the usual things on here, things like professional development, you know, the intellectual community. So basically, you know, the folks that you would actually bounce off ideas, looking at, helping with visioning and looking at where a research field is going. But then you also might have folks that are kind of the ones that provide you substantive feedback. Like, who are the set of people that you can share a paper with, or a draft of a grant or a paper, and they'll give you deep feedback. And in a lot of these cases, there's reciprocity involved as well. You would also give them feedback. So if you think about it, these aren't always the same people. You don't want to ask the same person about everything, right? You know, what should I do for my career? Should I take on this sabbatical? Should I, can you edit this paper? Everybody has a different perspective. And if you think about, as a simple exercise to filling out this chart, it's actually not easy to fill out because it forces you to think more broadly about, well, who would actually be the best person to give me advice on startups? Who would be the best person to give me advice on my career path or to take on a leadership role? So this is one way to kind of think about who those people are, and you don't have to figure it out in one day, but as you think about expanding your career and your work, this is something to kind of consider. And there's some things in there that are really important. Emotional support, right? The faculty life is a grueling process, just like grad school was. And so those are things to often think about. But also, there's other things like sponsorship. So what does that mean? So sponsorship is, you know, in an academic career, there's a lot of opportunities where you might get nominated for awards or those kinds of things. Who are going to be the people that look out for you for those kinds of things? Who's going to nominate you for an ACM Fellow Award? Or who's going to nominate you for a junior career fellowship or something like that? So having a network of people that can actually just look out for you in that regard actually helps. And you can be proactive about that. You have to be proactive about it because there's so many things going on in people's careers that you often forget about these kinds of things. And so having a plan around where your network, what your network looks like and who you reach out to for different kinds of advice, I think would really help. There's other things around accountability of what really matters. Often people are like, you know, I kind of know what matters, but you often want this second opinion, or you also want to be able to bounce off ideas in terms of, the thing I'm doing right now, does it really matter? Do you care about it? Do people care about it? But this is one way to kind of organize your thoughts around this. So we'll make the slides available, and you can take a look at this map more closely. But this is one way that you can think about how you can expand your network, because it forces you to think about different aspects of your career. So as I mentioned earlier, everyone's village is different in that, you know, depending on the style of work that you do, if it's a lot more theoretical, if it's a lot more applied, your network could be very different. It could be very much skewed towards having a lot more industry engagement, or you might have more engagement with NGOs or private organizations, nonprofit organizations. You might actually have working on things that are so far out, you know, 10, 15, 20, 30 years out, where your engagements are more with consortiums, with other academic institutions. So there's never a perfect balance. Like, it's not like you need a third industry engagement, a third academic engagement. You often hear about having to diversify your portfolio in terms of the kinds of collaborators in your network, but it actually totally depends on the kind of work you do. If your work is heavily biased towards industry, that's fine, but you just have to recognize that. The other thing is, this is something I've often seen my colleagues, and as I mentor junior faculty in my department, I've seen is that it's really easy to spread yourself very thin early on. So you want to start building deeper engagements than to get too broad way too early. So if you have a bunch of opportunities in industry, those opportunities are not going to go away. They'll always be there. So what you want to do is be thoughtful about creating the deep ones, those one or two strong, potentially industry partnerships, so that's just one example, then trying to be superficial across 10 of them. You might think that, oh, if I had 10 of them, I could get funding from all 10 of them. But it's really, at the end of the day, is you want those people to be advocates for the kind of work you do, and that's the most important thing you can get out early. That's one of the most important things in your career, because it'll have this snowballing effect that if you have this great engagement with industry and you're able to showcase it, then that will lead to more engagement later on. So this is something that's really critical, is having just a few strong, deeper relationships with your network rather than having a lot of people in that network. The other thing that I actually, in retrospect, found the most rewarding was when I engaged in opportunities for thought leadership. This is the best time to actually expand your network. So if you look, this event right now is a great event to think about. You know, we have agency representation from NSF. We have chairs and deans of departments here. We have folks that have been on the CCC. And before I joined the CCC Council, I was actually engaged in a lot of CCC workshops. I actually was invited to give a snowbird talk, where it's the All Deans and Chairs talk, which was an eye-opening opportunity where if you're in the middle of thought leadership and these activities where you're in these visioning exercises, you're actually in front of the people that are going to be potential sponsors in the future, or you're going to be in front of people that are thought leaders and you can learn from them. And so these are other ways to kind of think about how you can expand your knowledge in terms of, expanding your research village is looking at opportunities where you can get into these areas where you can actually start to drive the future of the field that you're in. So these are really low overhead but easy ways to engage the community. The other thing is showcasing your work. So as I mentioned, networking has evolved drastically. You know, a lot of the networking you can do, you can actually do it online, right? But what that's also has kind of enabled is different scales of showcasing your work. You know, it used to be in the case where if you wrote a research paper, you might get, you know, tens of people looking at it in depth. You know, there might be people that read the abstract, but how many people actually read the entire paper or go to a poster session? But research talks are another way to scale it, right? If you give a talk at a conference, you might get hundreds of people. But if you look at, but if you think about other ways of disseminating your work, like videos, right? You can get to a point where, you know, 1 million people look at your work. So you might want to think about broader ways of getting visibility in terms of the work that you do. You know, often, you know, videos or getting these things online or getting these things in front of people might be unorthodox in terms of a traditional academic research sense, but this is actually just as important, right? Getting the community, the broader community, the community outside the computer science community engaged in the work you're doing and seeing the value of that is an easy way to engage, expand your network beyond just the computing community that you're looking at. For the kind of work I do, it's really critical that the medical community and the other communities that don't even see the work I do in the computer science community see what we do. So there's other ways that we have to disseminate the work I do in my lab. And so now we're in a point where, you know, having impact and visibility is just as important as having those papers that are published too. Right, and so this is something to think about. That is that, you know, often we get stuck in writing these papers. We got our 10 papers done for the year. What are the next 10 papers? But you want to take a step back and look at it. Well, how do you broadly disseminate some of that stuff? And now it's gotten easier with new ways of actually, you know, disseminating that through social media, blogs, and even videos, and even the press. So I want to turn it over to Tom. Tom has a couple things that he wants to dovetail off of what I just talked about, and I'll let him continue on.
That's going to be a hard act to follow, but let's see what I can do here. I originally titled this Advice from a Grumpy Old Man, but these are some things that occurred to me after I looked over the slides that Sweetak had prepared. And so first thing that I think is important is in any academic endeavor, you're going to meet two kinds of people. Yeah, okay, so there is always two kinds of people, those who categorize people into two groups and those who don't, right? But key though, I mean, this is something I've seen a lot. One is the athlete, if you will, that views the field as this is a race to the summit and the goal is world domination, right? And the other one is the scientist, which is I'm going to do interesting work, and good work always wins the day. Now, I'm not making any value judgment about one or the other. And in fact, to paraphrase Guardians of the Galaxy 1, no one is 100% a competitor, okay? And I think it's really important for you to be honest with yourself and realize which one of these you are more of. And you will find that it's easier to build your network with like-minded people in one of these two categories. It doesn't mean ignore the other category, but it means that when I look around at the cliques that have formed in my field, it's clear that you either have the athletes or the scientists, and they form their different groups. That being said, when I was doing some volunteer work for the Computer Society, we were talking a couple years ago about, hey, you know, everything's going online and virtual. I bet conferences are going to go virtual next. And there was a lot of, no, that's a dumb idea. And it indeed is a dumb idea. That is because the pressing the flesh, if you will, the human interaction is fundamental to building your network. And Ever wonder why senior people never see a paper at a conference? Okay, Beth's laughing, but it's true, right? That's because the action's in the hallway. And a lot of times what we're doing isn't there to get up on the technical issues. It's really to build our network, talk about different, well, you're going to learn this, different funding opportunities coming down the pike, which is something we have to worry about, but when you were students, you did not. So introduce yourself to senior people. And I can't emphasize that more. Don't be afraid of them. There's a gentleman in my field who is very frightening to people. I don't know if anyone knows him. His name is Yale Pat. You do, because no, well, he used to be at Michigan, yeah. And he's this tall, opinionated guy that if you introduce yourself to him, he's a really nice guy. But people are very intimidated and afraid to introduce themselves to Yale. I'm sure your field has people like that. Go ahead. And also, of course, don't ignore junior people either, right? Be part of that group as well. And one other group that I wish someone had give me some advice about, which are snobs, okay? Now, you know these people, you will interact with them, and in general, just don't let them get to you. I don't know why it is so characteristic in computer science that we have so many people that operate in this mode, but they do. And their reasons for snob might be different. It might be I'm at a top 10 place, or I've published the most referenced paper, or it doesn't matter. I found that really, if you look down deep, you'll find a really insecure person under there. But I think it's really important. I wish someone had given me this advice, because your first natural tendency is to boast back. And that just lowers you to their level. And then you end up just in, he said, she said, or just a dozen, as we used to say in elementary school. Okay, just make small talk and move on is my number one advice when you're dealing with snobs. Eventually, they will realize that you're really good, and all of a sudden, they'll stop being a snob to you. And so I encourage you, when you get there, to remember how it felt, and don't be a snob back. It's really good that when you're accomplished, to be open to new people, because let's be honest, the brain ages, okay? A lot of the good ideas are coming from those younger in the field. It's good to include them in your network. All right, let's talk about geek cliques. I think this is a natural and important issue that you need to think about. You have sub-communities that form naturally. For example, Sweetek and I are both Georgia Tech people, right? Go Buzz. We both have a horrible mascot. We have an insect or an old car. So not only do we have one bad mascot, we have two. So your university, your advisor, these kind of are the natural network builders that you start with, but although they're good, just don't stick to one clique. You will find the cliques, again, conferences in the halls, that's the best place to build your network, and also observe what the network in your community is. And I think it's really important to be as much part of as many cliques as you can. Go and crash a clique. There's one clique in my field that's one particular university and alumnus of that university, and it's at a big clique. And I don't, I'll go up and talk to those guys, even if they're talking about football and stuff, because what the heck? And they tolerate me. And I think it's important that as you do that, at least I found in my career, it's really good to cultivate the nice person image. That is, you want to be seen as the person who doesn't take sides, the person who's friendly to everybody. Take sides. What are you implying? That there's politics in this field? There might be a little, okay? But be really careful about that. It doesn't mean that you should be two-faced. You should state what you believe, of course, but don't overtly try to take sides. Try to be as open as possible. And one last thing I want to make a point about that I've observed, people say, oh, you're going to have frenemies. I don't really believe in that, all right? A lot of people, you've heard the term frenemy. I don't believe in that. I believe you either have colleagues or you have snobs. I'll call it that way. I would have used a different word, but anyway. If you view someone as an enemy, you're starting off on the wrong foot. And a lot of times, what I observed was that before tenure, this is kind of the image that an assistant professor has, that there's this monster under the bed called tenure. And if they put their foot on the floor, it's going to eat them. Now, what this does is it makes people do stupid things. It makes them go borderline unethical. I think sometimes they cross over that line because the pressure for tenure is so great. I encourage you not to do that. But be aware that there are those in your field who will succumb to the temptation. But here's the fact is, and you'll find this, as soon as you get tenure, you look under the bed and realize there's nothing there. I mean, the act of getting tenure, it gets built up to be so impossible and so hard, and honestly, it's hazing, okay? Academic hazing. There, I said it. But once you get tenure and you think about it, you think, all I had to do was do my work, do the right things, and I got tenure. It's amazing. I can't believe it. Why did I have to do, why did I cut corners on these things or be a snob? Okay, so what I've learned over time is with pre-tenure colleagues to post-tenure, I press the reset button when people get tenure. And my opinion of them, I go, okay, let me reset, let me pause and reevaluate them. And wow, you'll find that people's personalities really do change a lot when they come out the other side of that. Okay, that's what I wanted to say in my advice, but we're going to be up here to answer questions. So,
thank you. Yeah, that's it. All right, so what I want to do now is we'll open the floor for questions. And I know there are a lot of other folks in the room that could also provide. Beth and Greg might also have some comments, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. But yeah, so let's open up the floor for questions. Anything that's top of mind, thoughts, things that you're struggling with, things that may be struggling with, or any questions, or what's on your mind? Oh yeah, let me sit down. Go ahead.
Hey, I'm Lydia. Good to see you again, Troy.
Hey, Lydia.
So I have this networking question where very often I'll meet someone. This will probably happen to me here. I will just meet someone, we'll have a conversation, we'll exchange emails, and then nothing.
Right.
Is that just part of the algorithm that you have to prune some leaves? Like, is there any way to do something better there?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I call that the airline partner situation, where you have this conversation with the person that you sit next to on the airline, but you probably never have a conversation with them ever again, even if they give you their business card. It's actually an interesting one. And what I've found in the past is that it's not that they are not interested, is that the cognitive overhead and the cognitive overload in that situation, at a conference in particular, there's just so many things to follow up on. What I've done in the past is that if there was a really interesting conversation, somebody that you really want to work with more deeply or engage with, if you take the initiative to actually make that connection, a lot of times they will engage back, right? So what I've done in many cases is taken on the onus to be able to engage, right? And a lot of times it wasn't the fact that they're not interested or anything like that. It's really just, there's just a lot of things going on that it's really exciting initially, and then things just kind of taper because nobody follows up. So, and worst thing that can happen is they don't respond. All right, but at least you attempted. So I think that's one thing, is to go in with the mindset that everybody It's just that, the follow-up isn't there because they're not interested. It's just because there's just a lot of things going on, right? And so, so I've always made it a point that if it's something that I really want to, this is something interesting, I force myself to make that follow-up, right? But it's a good question. A lot of times, the small talk may not lead to anything, and that's fine. It's just recognizing that that's reality. But I think taking on the onus to at least try and see if there's anything deeper there is something that I encourage.
What he said, but let me add some more to it. When this has happened in the past, yeah, sending email works to some degree, but you got to be careful about that. Sending email to a senior person full of flattery, you will find out you get those kinds of emails every day from prospective graduate students, right? So those are going to go in dev null, all right? I think it's a better thing, although that can work, to try to, when you meet the person, try to establish some follow-up. Maybe I can come out and give a talk. I'm going to be out in your area sometime. Maybe I can come by, something like that. That helps. Second thing is follow up the second time. You see them the second time, go up and reintroduce yourself. Let me tell you, reintroducing yourself to someone who remembers that you already introduced yourself to them makes them really guilty, okay?
In a good way?
In a good way. It encourages them, I think, to try to make the connection, and that you eagerly want to make the connection. So that being said, I don't want to knock giving out business cards for one reason or another. They do work well. Sometimes, scribble on the back what you talked about as you hand it to them so that they can turn it over, because you get this deck of business cards after a conference and you're like, why did I even save this? I don't even remember these people.
Yeah, that's one of the things I did first 2 years when I joined UW, was that my business cards weren't actually business cards. They were little 3D printed sensor boards that we had built, and basically on the back of it was a URL to how to use it. And I would just hand those out, and then most of them I could tell, because you can tell what they downloaded and downloaded, is they wouldn't use it, but I would get an email back saying that, oh yeah, I remember I pulled that thing out of my, it was on my desk or in my bag like 2 years later that you gave me. So those are just little things that was one of my strategies, was to have something that really made it looked different, or something that basically set it apart, or at least they remember that, oh yeah, you worked on that kind of technology, and I made that connection. So those are little things that help in that regard, but the follow-up is interesting, where you can have a shared kind of common ground about what are you going to follow up on. If it's just like we're just going to sync, that doesn't really lead to anything. But you're right, in terms of having an actionable next step usually helps a lot in that regard. But also remember that one day you're a grad student, and you might go off a postdoc and become a professor. Like, even though you're the same person, when prospective grad students look at you, it's the same way. It's like, are they going to respond to my email, or they're going to be just as shy as reaching out to you? Where just like a few months ago, I was a grad student, and it was really easy for me to talk to people. And so you can also think about it the other way around, is that for grad students or other junior faculty, it's like how you react to that situation could also help you figure out what are ways that you can engage in the future.
Can I get your business card? That sounds really cool.
We don't do business cards anymore, so I don't do that anymore.
Don't.
Huh. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. This is Ramat from Johns Hopkins University. I just had a question about the slide that you show, I think, from the National Faculty Development. Mm-hmm. I think most of them seem kind of sort of clear how you should approach. One of them that you specifically emphasized was about being proactive for the sponsorship part. Yeah. It might be quite obvious for you, but I just want to know about practical ways of doing that. To my mind, I just don't know exactly how you can be proactive for that. What are the practical ways of doing that? How we can approach people, kind of remind them to kind of do that for
that's a good question. Yeah, and the sponsorship one is just, it could be everything from like a Google or a career fellowship, a Microsoft faculty fellowship, or anything like that. The way it's really hard to directly approach somebody. Will you nominate me for this thing, right? So the ways that I've seen been effective is that one of those nominators should be somebody in your in your university or in your department, right? So it could be a department chair, an associate chair that help facilitate a lot of those things. A lot of times in our departments, we have somebody that makes sure that we have an eye or a pulse on what are the different fellowships and are people being nominated for Sloan, et cetera. But they're the ones that can help identify who are the external members in your community, so outside of their university, that would be great letter writers, right? And they could be the ones that help facilitate that, right? And then they could, that team are the folks that already have a letter, they already know your work well enough that they can actually nominate you for other things in the future. But I think there's a couple ways to do it. One is you could approach somebody, but it's a tricky situation in that regard, because you want to have somebody that could talk candidly about your work, but know that it's going to be a strong letter or a strong support. But that's one way of doing it, is going through your department. Yeah, go ahead, Greg.
Quick trick is to tell your department chair, hey, I think we should have some more Sloan fellowship. It would make the department do it, because it's in their interest as a department to have more of these awards as well. So it's not so much that you have to put the focus on yourself as saying, hey, wouldn't it be great if we marshaled forces around departmental awards?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, San Hawk, University of Rochester. Shutek, I sent you an email last week. I haven't heard back. I'll follow up with you here.
Perfect.
But I had a question on mentorship. I mean, all the senior faculty are well-minded. They want to help people.
Sure.
But they're also incredibly occupied. And I felt that unless you are on the critical path, because they have a mission to accomplish something,
Yeah.
Then they're more likely to help you go out of their way to provide a support. Is that the right assessment?
I don't know. You know, my advice is to seek multiple mentors, both in your department and, so this isn't the topic of the panel, but what the heck, in your department, but also through your academic lineage and in your community. The more mentors, the better, is what I found. Sometimes you'll have a senior faculty member who's possessive of mentoring you. Try to spread it out anyway. But another point that's related to that is, look, the action is, especially today, is interdisciplinary. So get to know other people in your department, and this is actually also connected with the prior question. Get to know other people in your department, find out what they're doing, get interested in what they're doing, maybe attend some of their PhD theses, defenses, and things like this, because you never know when you're going to have an idea and you don't have knowledge in a space, and we have an expert over here, I can go talk to this person. And that's a fantastic way to also not only add to mentorship, but also end up with a lot of people who want to help you with letters, going back to the prior question. So the funds at the fringes, go out, go meet everybody and find out what they're doing. Don't feel like I have to be in my little silo and just talk to the senior faculty in my silo.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hey, thanks you two for your talk. I appreciate it. I'm Tawana Dillahunt, University of Michigan, and you didn't quite cover this, but I'm starting to get this question now because I have students who are thinking about graduating, on committees, mm-hmm. And I found that I had a question from a student that required me to network for the students, and I hadn't really thought about networking in that way. Yeah. Can you guys give some advice on the best way or effective ways to network for our students?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ways. One is to, as you're expanding your research village, you're showcasing essentially their work, right? And so, talking about the areas that you're moving into, new areas, exploration, I always make it a point to make sure I, talk about the students that are actually pushing the work forward. And at this point, a lot of people ask, after you get to a certain point in your career, like, where are you going next? It's like, I have no clue. It's where my students want to go. And so you want to make sure that they're at the forefront, and that's one way of doing it. The other thing I do is I also get the students to try to network themselves as well, because it's a hard thing to do, and I try to lighten it up a little bit. So like I've been in the last few years doing these things where I give them scavenger hunts or tasks It's like you have to come back from this conference with 5 selfies from, ACM fellows, or the 5 new Kai Academy selfies with these folks. And it lightens the situation up so much that it makes it really easy to engage. If somebody goes up, my advisor made me do a selfie with 5 Kai Academy, and it opens up the conversation. It's such an easy way of doing it. So I've done these little things where I give them an excuse and they can blame me on it, where they open up the conversations, and that goes a long way. And these are just simple things you can think about. But often a lot of times when I lead with the kind of work I'm doing, I usually put it around, I center it around the student. So-and-so is doing this new work, who is interested in this, has a couple years of graduating. So that's one way of you kind of building that into it. But it's critical that when you're networking, you're actually networking for your students too. That was a great question.
I just to add to that, I think it's really important when you go around to make clear that you're just the front person for your student group. A lot of times when I talk about research we're doing, I'll say, my student X is doing Y, and by the way, she's really good. And things like it's important to really advocate for your students. Sometimes that gets lost in the push to get yourself promoted, but really you should also promote your students as well. I like that idea of selfies. Then again, I hate selfies, so they would never get a selfie from me. But maybe that works in the Kai community, not so much in the architecture community. We're trying to stop you that way. So
but that's a great point. Is that often I might start the conversation, but I'll defer it to the students. Like they know more about this work than I do. They're smarter than me. So the follow-up could actually be to talk to the students. And that's been one. And the other one is you can prime the pump a little bit. So usually before a conference, I make sure to say, the students are doing some really interesting work, which is similar to the work your group is doing. Just keep an eye out. And usually they will seek them out.
And that's a good point too, that you will find, and this is an important point in networking too, when you come upon a competitor, there's 2 things you can do. You can, rosin your bow and try to compete, or you can say, let's collaborate. I have a friend who's excellent at this, and I think he's published with he's kind of the Erdos of computer architecture. He's published with virtually everyone in the field. That when he finds someone who's working on a similar idea, he'll approach them and say, hey, I have a student working on that too, let's collaborate. And that not only promotes your student, but also it's a great way to deal with that potential sticky situation when you're building your network.
Yeah, the other thing that has been always effective, and this is something, as grad students, you've probably also realized, was that it's a little bit easier to network with your colleagues and your cohort, and so they can introduce their advisors to you, right? So one of the things that my students often do is they network with other students that are grad students, and as a way, and they can help introduce their advisors, right? So there's multiple ways to do that. So that's usually the advice I usually give the students as well. Other questions? So one of the questions around, that you have this critical path that somebody that a senior member of the community or a researcher might have, and you have this question or this thing, is it going to derail them? Are they not responding because they're not interested? For a lot of us, it's actually just because there's just so much going on. It's not like we're not interested. It's just that we will get to it at some point, right? And so for me, if somebody asks me twice, 3 times, 4 times, I'm okay with that. I just know that that's an important thing, and I should get back to it, right? Like the email, like your follow-up email, I knew that was important, so it's still on my to-do list. It did not get cut off my to-do list, because if somebody doesn't follow up, it means that probably wasn't as important, right? And you do have to be careful with that. Some people just don't like the emails over and over again, but there is this like timeout period, right? You got to figure out what the sensitivity is like at what point do you resend that email? But if I get pinged again, I'm okay with that. I like getting pinged because at first it reminds me, secondly, it makes it clear that this is important, and third, I will it sends signal that it will get on my to-do list.
I don't know if you've gotten to the point yet where your email box is unmanageable.
Everybody says at this point.
But every now or then I just mark everything red and figure out if it was really important. People come back and bug me. So just make sure when you bug me, you don't say, why didn't you reply to my prior email? Or, I sent you an email 2 weeks ago and you haven't replied. So, come on. It's just pointing out that I suck at email.
There's a nice way of doing that one.
Yeah. yeah, definitely.
Yeah, one of the things, I haven't done it lately, but I used to do it a few years ago, is I would pick up the phone and make a phone call. And that's a good way to.
What is this telephone you speak of?
Yeah, these days I don't have a phone in my office anymore,
Yeah,
but it used to work.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Chen Hao Tan from University of Colorado.
Yeah.
Greg mentioned creating an onion subfield of yourself,
Yeah.
and like that's a question I've been thinking, but I'm not sure like what would be, and do you have any tips towards that goal? And like I've tried to organize a workshop recently, and I think like there is also many different, like the thing that I'm thinking about human-centered machine learning is really interdisciplinary. There are different places, conferences you can put the workshop. There are different communities that you may want to target, but it will make them slightly deviate from what they usually do. I guess just wondering whether you have any tips on that.
That's a good one. That is it's a great thing to do. It is tough to do. I did that when I was assistant professor around workshops and things. The thing is, you got to find people at the periphery and engage them and expand the scope a little bit to include them. For me, because what I was doing at the time was compiler code generation, it was mostly industrial people that I ended up inviting, and then the scope slowly grew to academia. But I think if you just put a stake in the ground and say, I'm doing this one thing and I'm going to have a workshop on it, no one's going to show up. So that's another approach you can do is to have a tutorial. If you're onto something hot and you know people are interested, hold a tutorial at a conference, maybe with a partner with a senior person or something like this, and then that helps to lead into the workshop that comes next. So.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's one way of doing that is that is you'll get engagement if everybody else's voice is heard and their input is in there, and so it's more to facilitate a conversation that you can potentially nudge the direction of that work into kind of the area that you're interested in or where you think your hypotheses are going to be sound. But I think you want to be able to be inclusive enough that you have the diversity of opinions reflected. And sometimes when things are too narrow, it does actually become very hard, because when I see workshops or panels or workshops or tutorials that are very narrow, then it's like, oh, well, that's out of my scope, and how can I contribute? So I think there's this tricky balance there. But Greg's advice in terms of having the subfield, which you are thought as the thought leader, that is a good way of thinking about that, right? And so to network into your subfield into the larger field, I think you have to have those connections and the openings that allow people to engage, so that their influence can actually be, or their words can actually be heard. Yeah.
Thanks.
I have one thought that's not fully formed, but I'm Sarah Iribarren from the University of Washington. I'm actually new there, but I am maybe a wannabe in this area, a bit on the outskirts. I'm wondering, so I'm in the School of Nursing, health informatics as well, biobehavioral nursing and health informatics, but I feel like sometimes when I'm in different settings or conferences that are maybe outside of my comfort zone, or even approaching other people who I may want to collaborate with, like how to think about framing your thoughts or your interests to be able to have a better interaction and communication.
Boy, let me tell you the one trick that I use that I think works really well, especially when approaching senior people, is to read one of their papers in depth. And you go up and you say, you know, that paper you wrote on blank, that was really great. And you relate that to what you're doing, and first you flattered the heck out of them, right? and so now they're going to give you attention. But second, it opens the avenue to talk about your work and sort of make the connection and bridge over to a community that I understand is maybe next door to yours, but not really yours. So.
And actually, so I think you can use your depth in nursing in particular as an advantage there, where often when we're talking about the work we're doing, or even at a conference, it's this narrow sliver of the work we're doing, but when you have new domains or new applications of something that was just presented, that's like the most exciting thing I can hear, right? So when somebody that has background in nursing or a health professional or somebody in a different domain looks at the work and they're like, you know what, we could actually do something interesting here, that's like the most exciting thing to hear. So I think you actually have lots of opportunities to engage. In fact, coming in with another perspective and a background and saying, you know, there's something really interesting here. Here's an area I know really well. Could we do something here? Or here's some new ways to take the work. Like that is an easy way to engage somebody and a very exciting one, right? And so I think I would seize that opportunity to actually engage people, because you have this domain expertise where you can take these different research trajectories in new ways. So yeah, so I think that's one thing, and yeah, either through the research paper that you read or through a conference talk or something that you've seen or somebody presented, or even connections that somebody else have made saying that, you know, this person is doing this kind of work, which is in the personal health informatics space, but here's another angle you can take on it, or take some other really technical work that they haven't applied it in that domain and trying to see where that could go in. I think that's a great conversation starter, and that helps. I think for me that would be huge to see if a new domain, another area that can apply the work we're doing.
Yeah, just make sure you read the paper really well. Okay?
Other questions? Thoughts? Yep, lady.
Okay, so Thomas, you in particular talked about navigating the space of different people, and some people are snobs. I agree with that. And so this idea of like not getting back and forth into little, I don't know, one-upches kind of conversations. I also find that some people feel like they have to be impressed by you before they're willing to talk to you. Have you met that type of person before?
Oh, maybe a couple times, yeah. But you know, the thing is, you can't impress them standing there. You just can't. They're going to be impressed by the work you do, and then so just be polite, be nice and natural. But it's that point where they seek you out or where they're open to you will come later in time. I don't think you can sit there and advocate for what is important about your work. I tried. I've tried that, and it just doesn't work. You know, they hear is, oh yeah, you wish you were as great as me. You know, just wait until you get the momentum, and then I think you can plug, or you can try the other approach where you just flatter the heck out of them, right? Although I have found with snobs that you can't. There's no limit to flattery. There's really no way over that.
I mean, you can do a certain like amount of name dropping of like, oh, this person, I found that sometimes gets through to people. Like just me as but if I mention like, I don't know, people I've worked with, like maybe they respect my advisor or they know him, and like suddenly they're now open to this. But I don't have to start every conversation with trying to find a thing that will make this person open up. I don't know. Should I just move on, or?
You do have to develop a strat. For me, the pleasantries and moving on worked well. I have done the name dropping, and you know, my advisor's a giant, but I really recommend that you don't lean on your advisor's reputation anyway at this point in your field, but in your career. But yeah, you can try that. It depends on the person. I'm talking about the extreme, but you're right. There are people that'll let down their guard if you point out that you have a friend in common, or you know someone who maybe you're friends with one of their students or something like that.
Yeah, it is a tricky one. I mean, as Tom said, it's best to take the high road in a lot of those situations. But if there's an important thing that will enable like some work you're doing that you need to engage with somebody like that, you know, one is try to find common ground, or if you know, collaborate with somebody that opens up the conversation, or having a united front with another set of collaborators that you work really well together, where together you can go in and say, you know, this is something that we want to do, that may let down the guard a little bit more, is if you have a united front with another set of folks that you're like-minded, that's sometimes effective as well.
There's also a sort of is it worth it decision at some point here too. So
that's one thing I've noticed is if I make explicit mention that I'm a faculty and not a grad student, I get further in the conversation. So that's something I try to do. I flatter myself to still think I could pass as a grad student.
Yep.
Yeah, that definitely helped. You know, all of you should do that. At least let them know you're not grad students.
Hi, Nathan McNeese, Clemson University. So kind of piggybacking off this conversation we're having right now, what are your tips and advice for having these conversations, but not coming off in a braggy type way? Because I think there's a fine line of, hey, this is my research, I'm accomplished. You want to do that, but you don't want to come off too strong, I think. At least I don't, so.
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I mean, setting the context is always important. So, talking about what your work is, where it went, and even showcasing the fact that I have this talk at this conference, I presented this last year, and here's the follow-up work. You can definitely show the trajectory of the work and the breadth of and the depth of your work without having in a braggy way at all, right? And a lot of times that context is really helpful, because if I meet somebody for the first time, like in a very short period of time, I kind of get the history of kind of what you've done and where you're going. That doesn't, for me, seem braggy at all, right? And I think, so it is a tricky balance, but I think a lot of it is if you can show the context of what you're doing and where you're going, and you can work in the breadth of your work. I think you can do that pretty effectively. And I think what Tom was talking about, the snobs, is they lead off with the numbers or the stats and those kinds of things. Those are the obvious ones. And for me, that doesn't work at all, because I mean, you could have 20 papers, but they can be cited by one person. You can have one paper that has a lot of citations. So people think of impact in different ways, right? So I think it's more about what you're passionate about and what you're. I think that's been what I've found effective when people talk to me is if I see the passion coming from them about their work, that's what I really care about. So as long as it seems like excitement and passion, not braggy, I think that's the big difference there in my mind.
Yeah, just to go back to another suggestion, which was to, also, if you're familiar with their work, compliment on their work, and then try to connect it to yours. That always helps a lot. Don't say that we improved upon your work or we fixed a flaw, of course, but you want to say, I have a student working in that area too, and we did some interesting things, and I'll send you a paper or something like that. So that helps. Watch out for fragile egos.
Anything else?
Do you have any fears of networking? How many of you, so something that you said which is good is that most of us are introverts. It sort of kind of goes with the job, but not all of us. You will find there are fantastic extroverts in the field that tend to dominate the hallway conversations from time to time, right? So anybody who feels that they're really good at networking already? Are you really good?
I have technology that can train you to do that.
Wow, that's a meta answer. I like that.
Yeah, I think a lot of it goes back to, so I would characterize myself as an introvert. A lot of people probably don't think I am. I totally am, actually. I always get that reaction. So when I did the scale, Myers-Briggs, yeah, Myers-Briggs, I'm a total introvert. But I think my personality changed as my career advanced as a junior faculty member, because I focus a lot on, and I talked about deeper engagements, so kind of staying in the safe zone, but using that as a way to deepen my engagement, created a broader network for me because I had other people to help facilitate those connections outward, right? I think that helped a lot. So having smaller, deeper connections early on that would start to expand. And as you start to expand your research village, and as you have a foot in these different communities, like maybe the CRA or the CCC, in your research community, then you just open up at that point. And you're more comfortable because you've engaged enough in those communities that you have enough like-minded people there that you can commensurate with. And so I think that was the thing that was how my village expanded. Was it did start much smaller, but I think as I got the confidence after a few years, I think that's when it started to really, it was more exponential at that point. I don't think it's linear, it's definitely exponential.
Just to go back, it's a shame that introvert has become sort of a pejorative. It's not. The only difference between an extrovert and an introvert is where your happy place is. If your happy place is being alone, then you're an introvert. If your happy place is being with a group of people, you're an extrovert. But either one can swim in the other sea, right? And so even if you're an introvert, if you really have to, even if you don't like it, deal with being in, well, maybe answering questions in front of a group of people, but that's also a little too self-referential.
I can share a strategy that I've tried in the past. So I hate networking because it's just like, I find it very nerve-wracking. But whenever there's a presentation, I always take the time to ask a question. And often that gives perspective down the hallway to other people to come and engage.
Sure, that's a good point.
That's one way to throw yourself out there with the question so that other people can find you.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, and that's an advice that I give grad students a lot as well. It's like grad students are always apprehensive to ask a question at a talk. It's like, this is the best time to ask a question to the author or the presenter. And so that's always very hard for them to do that, but that's something that we often encourage for grad students as well.
Only when you ask, make sure you introduce who you are when you ask the question. I don't know why, but faculty go up and ask questions in my conferences and they'll always introduce who they are. Grad students won't say anything. Yeah, so you're going to have to cross that barrier.
Kind of on those lines, how would you, what kind of strategies would you recommend for having engaging presentations? I think a lot of times we don't get trained for teaching, but also for, I guess, the scientific, we have some expectation of how you present things, but I think, I mean, from arts and acting or various things, maybe we can take some of those tips to make it more exciting to present your work. What have been your strategies? Because I think that's where I'm always the most fearful is
interesting. Yeah.
not presenting it in an exciting way, or not, fearing that I won't be able to answer the questions.
So there's a couple of things that I learned to do over time. One is you'll find out as you continue to work hard on your teaching, you're going to be much better at presenting and be able to work on the fly a lot better. Another one, though, is the practice. Practice in front of, get feedback from people, practice, make sure it's engaging, but also think about what is the next question in people's minds, and let me answer that. And so when I give a presentation that way, that turns to work well. When I'm really comfortable with the material, when I'm solid and comfortable, I only need one slide. I can just talk forever. Part of that is because I think I am an extrovert in front of a crowd, honestly. That also comes from teaching. So.
Yeah, it's the standard advice we typically give or get for a presentation is that you don't want to regurgitate the paper, right? You don't want to just like spoon feed the paper. You want to motivate somebody to actually read the paper. The way I often think about a presentation, I actually haven't given a talk at a conference in forever, but what I typically encourage my grad students to think about is how would you talk about this paper if you couldn't put it in the right text in the paper, right? There's just some things you can't articulate in writing that you can articulate visually through videos, through demos, or through just talking about your work, right? And so often to ask them to think about it in that lens. Obviously you want to talk about the main points about the paper, but how would you showcase this work that you couldn't do in writing, right? And so that actually goes over pretty well, where things like demos and visualizations and those kinds of things you can actually show that proves the point, right? And I think that goes over really well, where you get a piece of the research and your thoughts around it, where it's different from the paper, right? And it really motivates somebody to go deeper into the paper. And so having that as a way to engage is a great one. And not everything can be demoed, obviously, but there might be other ways to visualize or showcase your work.
It's a very Kai answer, yeah.
Yeah,
But indeed, avoid making your slides too wordy. God, I don't know why people do that, but they do, right? You're not supposed to have full sentences on slides. I personally have a pet peeve about people who walk through an outline. All right, here's what my talk is about. And then they'll spend 10 minutes on the outline slide, right? And then they keep on bringing up the outline slide. And I don't know, someone probably told you that's the right thing to do, but it's boring as all get out.
So we don't have a lot of time to transition, so I'm gonna
one more.
Last question, and then we'll transition, and then we'll take the last question. But I'm around for lunch. You're around for lunch, so find us.
It's not really a question. It's a comment.
Okay, great.
As you're building your network, don't forget your program officer.
No, yes.
Keep them informed. Talk to them. Come review on panels. Be part of that community too. But talk to your program directors and keep them informed.
Yep. Mimi is a program officer at NSF who's going to be around today and tomorrow, so find her.
Okay.
Great, thanks. Thanks, everyone.